Still got some people in the lobby. Okay, good. All right, you're ready to start? Yep, okay. So thank you for making the time for this afternoon. I hope you're going to find it useful. This is the second in our series of ESOL webinars, exploring issues to do with ESOL. If you didn't catch last term's webinar, as I say, I think it was in November, I guess we still got the recording. You could always request it. So I think people found that useful. So today we're going to focus on embedding green issues in ESOL teaching and assessment. And I've got some ideas to share with you, some thoughts and principles. Hopefully, as I say, you'll find those useful. I hope also you'll find it provocative. But what I would say is a lot of what I'm going to say about green issues in some ways could apply to many different current issues in the world at the moment. Green issues in a way is quite a safe one to pick because it's perhaps a little less controversial. I think we're beyond the time when people deny that climate change is happening. People may have different views about what should happen as a result, but I think we've kind of crossed that hurdle for the vast majority. There are other issues which are obviously much more controversial and difficult to deal with. Maybe we'll tackle those at some point in the future, but for now, I thought it would be just better to pick one that we're kind of all in agreement on and show you how language and how involving your learners with the language of the issue can actually bring something to the classroom and also give learners something to take away from the classroom at the same time. So you can, I know you're busily letting people in from the lobby at the same time. If we can go to the next slide, that'd be great. I'll just show you the aims of the session. So we're going to finish at 3:30 today. I hope that's what you think. And these are the things that we're going to try and cover during the session. So what is meant by green and environmental concerns and actions? That in itself is quite an interesting thing to tackle with learners. And I'll give you a particular resource or an indication of where you can go to find a definitive, as much as there is, list of what those things might be. Then to explore obviously the reasons for tackling these concerns in ESOL, why bother? Some of that's going to be obvious, perhaps some of it will be a bit more provocative. Then I want to give some examples of how to integrate green issues in ESOL teaching, and also follow on from that, show how to do it at different levels. I assume that most of you teach at more than one level in ESOL, and you may not, but even so, you need to be knowing what your learners are going on to. So if it's something that your institution might be concerned about tackling, then it'll be useful to know about other levels as well. Then I want to show you some of the stuff we do in our own ESOL assessments to look at environmental and green issues. And then finally, to look at links with other subject areas, which is always on the fringes of ESOL teaching, I think, but we'll come back to that a little bit later. Okay. So let's start off by looking at what we mean by green and environmental concerns and actions. So already, even just the first point, saving energy, is something that so many of us are concerned with. It's now reaching right across society, isn't it? So I'm sure you can understand that that isn't just a green issue. It's also an economic issue, but then are the two things ever separate? Perhaps now we're just becoming a bit more aware of the absolute connection between these two things. So saving energy, okay, how to travel. It's an interesting one. There are more and more interesting actions being taken at local level around travel, so which are stirring up many controversial responses, perhaps. That's not quite right, but different responses, let's put it that way. We only have to think about Stop Oil, or in our area around Islington and Hackney, the local transport networks which exclude cars from certain areas are already causing a lot of issues. I'm sure you heard about that in the Uxbridge by-election as well, apparently being a factor. So already it's not just what it used to be, which was if you were green, you got a bike. and you didn't use a car anymore. There are now much more complex and nuanced and interesting issues that are starting to emerge around the whole issue of travel. And I'm only talking about local travel, let alone national and international travel. There are many issues around that, which will continue to be issues for a good long time. So that's one. Consumption, or reduce, reuse, repair and recycle, which is that a panacea? You know, we can carry on consuming as long as we do a bit about reusing stuff, and you know, we repair things every so often and whatever, and then we can still consume happily. Or should consumption be reduced? And in a moment I'm going to show you where this all comes from, and you'll see the kind of level at which this is working, if I can put it that way. How and what to eat. Who took part in veganuary? I wonder, terrible name, but I wonder if any of you or any of your learners did. And how you found that. I have to confess I didn't, not overtly. I did cut down on meat consumption, and that was a good thing to do, so at least it had some impact on me. But I wasn't as committed as perhaps some were. But again, there'll be people in your classes probably who are quite passionate about these issues and want to be able to talk about them. Cutting pollution, that's been around for years, but what does that actually mean? What is pollution? Is pollution just physical pollution? Is it noise pollution? Is it the pollution of us just living closer and closer to each other in urban environments? What does that actually mean? So some interesting discussions around that to be had as well. How to spend our money, which I think for most of us is becoming a bigger concern as we have less of it. And I think we're concerned to use it more effectively, and to also think about the impact where we do have things like savings. Where can we save and where can that make a difference? These are all obviously much bigger issues than ESOL, but you can see, I'm sure already, how they can be part of an ESOL discussion. Okay, and then how to speak out, how to protest. And again, I think 5 years ago, that probably wouldn't have been as controversial as it is now. I don't know why, but I seem to have endless videos coming up on YouTube when I look at it, about Just Stop Oil protesters being beaten up as they sit in the middle of the road or forcibly removed by motorists. Usually, and I don't know if this says something about other videos I watch, but usually celebrating that that's what motorists have done, which is not something I'd necessarily, well, it isn't something I do at all. So anyway, how to speak out. Now, if you just click on the last one, I want to show you where this all comes from, because as I said, it is quite difficult to tie down what are the big concerns, but this has come from the UN, and it's quite, if you just put that into Google, you'll get to the same website that I used here, the Act Now 10 Actions. You can see that there aren't actually 10 actions there. I've left a few out, which may not be quite so relevant to the classroom, or I've conflated some. Certainly the consumption and reduce, reuse and so on is 2 actions there. So I think that's a good starting point in a number of different ways for the classroom. On the one hand, you can make it obviously a brainstorming activity. You can say, well, what do we mean by these things? And the interesting thing is it's obviously not just limited to English, but it is in an English language concern, is we have so many presumptions behind words that are now overused. So we use the word green, we use the word environmental. What do we actually mean, or what do we think we mean when we use those words? And it would be an interesting exercise for you to ask people who are native speakers outside of the classroom, maybe colleagues, just do a quick brainstorm, what do those words mean, and record in some form their meanings, and then do the same with your learners and see where the match is and where the mismatch is, and then look around where these assumptions have come from. One of the things I think sometimes we miss in the ESOL classroom is, understandably, we are so concerned with things like vocabulary and syntax and grammar, as we should be, that we miss the roots behind the language, and we miss the assumptions that are made behind that. So in the classroom, we can be teaching correct language, if I can put it that way. But when the learner goes out into the their local environment, well, it is an appropriate word to use, isn't it? Into their local environment, how are they encountering the same vocabulary that we have taught in the classroom? Are they encountering it actually in the way that we've taught it, or is there now different meaning? Just think for a moment about a very loaded and obvious term, and think, and you may have already had this discussion with your learners, think about the impact of this term and the misunderstandings your learners may have around it, let alone us in the wider society. The word woke. What does the word woke actually mean? It's now become an insult. But why? And why do we use it so easily? In the past, 5 years ago, it was probably politically correct, which actually sounds like a good thing. But if you were accused of being politically correct, you then had to defend yourself. In the same way as if today you're accused of being woke, you have to defend yourself. Now, to an early language learner, that really makes no sense, because to be woke surely is a good thing. And it was for a long time. You were waking up to what was going on. And maybe for some of us, we still defend it as a word, but it's harder and harder to make that defense. And I'm sure if you ask colleagues, without in any way, if you could try and load it into a chat without having any preparation for it, so you kind of almost surprise them with the word and just say, what comes to mind when I say the word woke? You get some very interesting responses. So in the same way, it's perhaps a little less loaded than that word. I've chosen one that is quite a provocative word, I think, at the moment. But in the same way, if you ask people to say, what do you think of when you think of environmental actions? It'd be interesting to see what they thought and then what your learners thought. And of course, not forgetting the fact that your learners have come, in many cases, from other parts of the world quite recently, and their experience of their environment may be very different from our experience of the environment, where most of the time all we do is complain about the weather. And we have an occasional storm that is a bit more dramatic than it was before. And some of you may live in areas which have flooded recently, and in that case, you're seeing the impact much more than you ever did before. But we're not perhaps at the level of degradation that other people in other parts of the world may be, and therefore may be more at the forefront of their concern. And this is leading me on to another thing. It's partly why I chose the UN as a place to go for this. Your learners, in many ways, are going to be more expert about this subject than you. Their experience of it may be much more recent, it may be much more direct, and they may have things to say that you've never heard before, or that other learners in your class have never heard before. So this is one of those issues where in the ESOL classroom, we kind of change our role a little bit, which I think can be quite refreshing. We can step back from being so much the expert and much more of the facilitator of language to enable people to say what they want to say and to perhaps say it better. Okay, so if we go on from there. Okay, so why green the ESOL classroom? I've kind of led into this, I think, from what I've said before, but let me just reiterate some of these things. We're all affected by the environment. They're around us all the time. And if we take the environment in its broadest meaning, it doesn't matter whether there's an issue in it with it or not. It doesn't matter if we live in the most perfect environment possible. It's still an environment that is affecting us, and in that case, perhaps needs protecting. And we're all daily going to be affected by the environment. Probably in many ways, in many ways, we shut those things out. We don't think about them. It just happens around us, and we're not even conscious of the effect upon us. As I've already said, it creates a level playing field. We perhaps even reverses the playing field to some extent. It actually allows your learners to become a little bit more expert than they might be otherwise. And that in itself links to the next point, which I didn't overtly mean this when I put that there, but I think it's something I'm thinking about now. If your learners feel that they have something to say that they know more about than most people in the classroom, including yourself, then there's quite a motivation in that, and a sense of I do actually have a voice, and it is worth me speaking. And even if not every learner in the class feels that straight away, by having some speak who perhaps don't always, and voicing concerns that perhaps they've not heard before, might then motivate others who may be a little shyer, a little bit more reticent, who perhaps aren't, and you all know who they are in your classes, maybe a little bit more the person who just likes to observe, but might get motivated in a different way. I think a very important point, but perhaps a reason that we sometimes avoid these issues in the classroom is that it is a complex issue. There are no simple fixes. As our government, and even dare I say our opposition, are discovering at the moment, they keep trying to come up with a simple fix. And every time they do, there's another thing they need to think about that they didn't think about in the first place. And it's challenged by one expert or another. I think personally that the sheer complexity of the subject is actually a reason to bring it into the classroom and to actually say, okay, we may not come up with answers, but let's start talking around these issues. What I've usually found when you do that with a subject that is more complex is that there's a kind of a moment where learners are thinking, well, what are you doing here? How is this helping my language? But if you persist a little, that kind of gets forgotten as people start to engage with language. I'm thinking about a class that I had this morning where we started talking about, we were looking at an older text. It was actually an early David Attenborough text from 1950s, which has some really rather uncomfortable representations of local people in Guyana, ones I'm sure he wouldn't be happy with right now. But we were looking at it to look at text within its social and historical context. Obviously, this was at a higher level. And there was that kind of moment of reticence with the students where, why do we need to be talking about this? But that only lasted for a moment. And it only took one student to get annoyed about the way language was being used, for the other learners to get involved, and for there to be a really interesting discussion. And what I found my role was at that point was I could kind of sit back a little bit, but record some of the language they were using. So that at the end of the process, I was able to reflect back to them some of the phrases they'd used, discuss those phrases, unpack them with them, correct some of the terminology where it had been slightly askew, and actually make this a really rich resource in terms of language. And if I'm going to give it a title, I think I'd call it the language of representation in this case. How do we represent other people? And as one of my students very astutely said, how do we stop othering people by the language we use about them? And that's an incredibly complex topic, but this was a level 1 class, and they were able to talk at quite length about it. Now, similarly, in these issues, there are terms that can be used that are quite complex and perhaps not fully understood, but that's your opportunity to grab that rich resource, to look at the language the learners are trying to use, and to point out and show them where it's being used really effectively, but then also tackle some of the stuff where maybe there's a bit of misunderstanding, and these are other ways that we could express it more effectively. And what you're doing by doing that is going back to the point above, motivating subject. What you're doing is you're actually giving learners a reason to be there apart from just learning language. And let's face it, most of our learners are in the ESOL classroom because they want to do something else. They're not there because they're language experts coming to learn in ESOL. So if we can give them another level of motivation, then of course that's to the good. Okay, another reason for talking about it is the overriding concern of our time. We're in election year this year. We know our politicians are going to at least talk about it some of the time. Probably won't be the major concern because they're a bit behind the rest of the population. But when they catch up, they'll be talking about green issues. So your learners are going to hear this language on the news, maybe read it in newspapers or on websites if they do, and they'll want to talk about it in the classroom because they won't fully understand it. Slight sidestep on this. I don't know if any of you at the beginning of your class do the thing of allowing 10 minutes, which is what I always do, 10 minutes for the learners to bring a word or a phrase that is bothering them. That's a word that I tend to use. What's bothering you this week? And often you get some wonderfully funny misunderstandings of words that learners have heard. I'll give you one example. It's nothing really, well, it is to do with the environment. I had a Thai learner last week come, and she said, "What's the name for that flower? Yellow." And for some reason in my head, I was thinking about cooking. So I was thinking of things like semolina and other yellow flowers I could think of. Chickpea, I even thought of at one point, but it wasn't any of that. And she's getting more annoyed. And then she said, "No, it grows." And I suddenly clicked, oh, she meant a flower in the ground. And I thought, well, what can she be talking about? And then she tried to say it. And I won't try and recreate it because it wouldn't be fair, but it was way off. But I heard that the first letter was a D, and for once I woke up and realized she was trying to say daffodil. And she'd been bothered about that. And she's a quiet learner. She wouldn't normally speak at the beginning of the class, but it had been really bothering her because her neighbor had some growing in their window pot, and she wanted to compliment them, but she didn't know what to say. So, you know, happily, it took some time to drill the word daffodil because there's some sounds in that you don't apparently have in Thai. I didn't know that, but there are. But at the end of the lesson, she left the room, she looked at me and said daffodil perfectly. She looked at me online. This is an online class, but it's the same point. And if you have 10 minutes like that at the beginning of the lesson, you could say, right, next week, I'm going to want language to do with environmental concerns. See what you can bring. And there's a real motivation in that. Okay, last point on this slide, but also a very important point. Language learning can never be divorced from concepts. I've already alluded to this. You know, if we talk about the word green, it's got a concept behind it, which changes with time. So if we're going to effectively teach learners, and perhaps this is the difference between ESOL and EFL, but if I really knew the difference between the two, I'd be a very rich man. I don't. But I think this could be an indication that we want the learners to be able to take what they've learned in the classroom, as I've already said, out into the world that they experience and understand the concepts behind it. What do the local people mean by such and such a word? And I know that, I don't know if they're here today, but I noticed on the list we had somebody from Oldham coming to this, and I'm sure that there are some words in Oldham that aren't ever used down in Hackney. So you're going to be hopefully teaching those words, and they may even be words related to the environment. You know, but there are probably words around here that we use that you wouldn't use either because of the experience of living in Hackney or Islington as compared to living in Oldham. Okay, we move on. So here's just some initial thoughts. This is quite simplistic, but it's a start. So the language of green issues, what are we looking at? Obviously vocabulary, that's always going to be there. And I've given you some words that I looked at. What's the resource called? Where you put in lots of words and you see which are the most commonly occurring terms, like a word map or whatever it is. I used that. I looked at one of those online. I think it was produced by Cambridge University. And believe it or not, when you put in green issues, these are currently some of the most commonly occurring words and phrases. I didn't predict that, but that's what people are talking about, apparently, a lot. Now, that might be politicians talking about these things a lot, might be scientists, it might be other experts, but those are words that apparently are being said a lot in society around us. And I wonder how much we could now debate, but we don't have time. But I wonder how much we would agree on what those different terms mean amongst us, particularly, for example, a term like slow sitting. I wonder if you know what that means. And if you ask people in Oxford, they'll have one view. I recently was in Oxford and I had a vociferous rant from the receptionist at the hotel about what slow sitting meant to him, before hearing a completely opposite point of view from a friend later that day. And slow city would mean something different in London altogether. So that's a term, but also even carbon neutral. It's a term that we hear all the time, but really, can anything be carbon neutral? Could Coldplay really put on a concert and be carbon neutral as they did so? I don't know. What does that actually mean in scientific terms? Some really good opportunities to dig deep there. Something I'm going to spend a little bit of time on in a moment is about the way now that we are being fooled, and not exaggerating to use that word, We're being fooled by people around us that they're doing things that they're not really doing, or that they're having an impact bigger than the one that they're currently having, usually because they want to sell us something. And I think it's important for all of us to be involved together in this. Sometimes I think with ESOL learners, what we can kind of feel is that until they've got to a certain level of language, they can't really be involved in society at the same level as everyone else. I don't think that's true. I think perhaps I did in the past to my shame, but I don't now. And I think that no matter what level your learners are at, they are in society now. They're affected by society. They can also have an effect upon society. And one of the most urgent things that we need to be dealing with, not just in terms of green issues, but right across the board, is how we are manipulated by language currently. There's a lot of power in language, and there's particularly a lot of power in language where words get repeated without being challenged. And so in my mind, at least, that's one of the reasons behind the growing levels of extremism across the world, that people are just accepting terminology without having the tools with which to challenge it. So I think it's important, no matter what the level of your learners, that they understand language can be, it's a plastic form, it can be manipulated, and it is particularly manipulated by people who understand that by repeating terms in a certain way, you need to, thank you for the thumbs up, you need to actually, you can actually influence people. I don't even need to say this, but just look at America right now. If it's hard to see in our own society, maybe we can see it better at a distance. And while I'm on this topic, I highly recommend to you a book by Naomi Klein called Doppelganger, which came out, I think, at the end of last year. And I've almost finished, and it's an absolutely brilliant read. It's very entertaining, but also very provocative. That goes to the next thing, passive and active forms. Sometimes people disown their responsibility, more often than not. People disown their responsibility by the use of the passive. An example I always give to my learners when they don't fully understand this, and this is absolutely true. It didn't happen here at OCN London, so I can say this here without implicating anyone around here, but at another organisation that I worked in previously, somebody came into a meeting, they were late, and their first statement to the room was, "My train got missed." If you ever need to teach the passive form, just remember that example, because it's absolute nonsense. But at less extreme levels, you can see how there is disownership of responsibility. And we all know it with certain people in our society who are disowning responsibility around COVID. You've only got to unpack some of the language of the inquiry to see how often the passive has been used, when really people should have been using the active form. But we get the same with environmental issues. Look at the language that business uses around us. More often than not, they're kind of saying it's not our fault, there's nothing we can do about that. And certainly, and this will be very relevant for some of you, if you look at the government website and you look at their response to the pollution of rivers, you'll see the passive form used all the way through the language in response to accusations around that. And they're doing it so that they can't be taken to court, but I don't know if that's actually going to work. Persuasive language, it's more obvious how people using friendly, lovely, green terms. You can look at many, many adverts on television right now, almost every single one seems to have some kind of environmental thing about it, and they're trying to say, look at the green things we're doing without actually saying that, but just in the background and the way the language is used. And I like this last point. Constructing powerful questions. How do you ask a great question which gets straight to the point? I recommend another book to you here, Alistair Campbell's most recent book. Can't remember what it's called now, but it came out last year, where he's basically saying, don't give up. And he has a great section on constructing powerful questions in there. Okay, if we move on. Okay, let's watch a bit of video. Hopefully this is going to work.
Do you want to mute yourself?
Yes, thank you for reminding me.
And hopefully this works.
Hey, we're making our cafe more sustainable. We're replacing all our plastic straws with paper straws.
Great. So are those paper straws recyclable?
Oh,
Did you know that our products are good for the environment? Do you have any proof of that? No, I don't have any of that. Did you know our products are all natural? So is arsenic, which is poison.
Did you know our products have a sustainably sourced label?
Did you get that independently certified, or did you make it yourselves? We're now CFC free.
That's good, but aren't CFCs illegal anyway?
Driving our fuel-efficient car can help you live more sustainably. Wait, but aren't your cars still burning fossil fuels? Which means that they're still being harmful to the environment. Did you know our flights cause 0 carbon emissions? No, that's just not true.
Okay. Sorry, just give us a moment. Okay, so I'm sorry that was a bit glitchy, but the reason I wanted to show that is because the examples given in that video are all genuinely taken from advertising. These are things that people have claimed in their adverts, some of which then have been banned. But do you know what? Sometimes a company wants its advert to be banned because it gets more notice that way. People go and look it up because we like to see things that are a bit naughty or a bit on the edge. So it's actually sometimes for companies' benefit to push the boundaries and aim at getting banned. Those are all genuine examples, and I just love the final one. I even remember the advert. I'm not going to name the company, but it's a non-English airline, but there was an airline that claimed that there were no emissions from their planes, which is, of course, absolute rubbish. Now, I've put here at the top of this slide, and if we click through the points here, I've put everyone's responsibility. It is up to us all, and maybe that's a bit of a stark statement to put at the beginning, but I think it is up to us all to take responsibility to not let these things just go. Going back to a previous point I made, terms get reinforced, language gets, more powerful because we don't challenge it. And greenwashing, and I'm not just talking about second language learners here, greenwashing relies on poor language skills. It relies on us just allowing these things to be in the ether around us and to not challenge them. It's not even a question of actively agreeing. The mere non-challenge of language allows it to continue, and it continues therefore to have an impact, to become part of the consciousness and so on. If we had challenged, and I go back to the previous example, if we had challenged the misuse of the word woke early on, it would never have had the power that it does now. And you know, that's a sad example. I can't really think of positive examples. Well, there are positive examples, usually around racial issues, actually, where language has been challenged. And dare I say it, the word queer has also been regained as well in recent time. But it's taken a lot of work and a lot of challenge and a lot of particularly challenge to poor assumptions behind language and the way it's used. Okay, if we go on from there. So find examples, get your learners to find some, to bring them to the classroom. This advert said this, what does it mean? Can it be true? Let's do some investigative work. I'm sure you can immediately see the rich resource that you can have in terms of reading around that. Now, I know some of you are going to be thinking, but that's beyond my language learners. I'm going to come back to that a little bit later, so just hang that up on a hook for a moment, okay? Examine the language, really take it to pieces, be forensic with it, look at the vocabulary that's used, look at what I was saying previously about the concepts behind the language. What is being hinted at by the way that that language is constructed by both the vocabulary that's used, but also, and this would be a higher level language skill, look at the construction of the sentences. What words are made prominent? What words are diminished by their placement within the syntax as well? Okay, and then have a go at this. It's great fun. If we had time, I'd love to come up with an example, but there's too many other things I wanted to get onto. But try rewriting. You know, how would you rewrite that claim about our airline has 0 emissions? You know, use as much of the same language as you possibly can, but make it truthful, and it would expose the fallacy of what is being claimed. And just by doing this, just by engaging in this way with language, you're helping learners to do this with other things. It's not just now about green issues. It's a focus, but you're helping your learners to understand that they can challenge and they can question language. It's as much their right and responsibility as anyone else's, to be honest. Okay. And is that it? Okay, right. So, yeah, if we go on to the next slide. So, okay, some perhaps obvious stuff to start with. When we're thinking about environmental issues and what we can do around them in the classroom, then start with the classroom. Get your learners to think about that, and to help them realize the environment means something that surrounds us all the time. So what is your learner's experience of the classroom? Get them to look around it. Do they like it? Do they not like it? Okay. Have some discussion, you know, amongst learners about that. What perhaps could be improved. So, discussion and research leading to writing. If I take a step out of green issues quite so directly from them, and think a little bit more about language learning and how we build language learning. I'm sure this is true for you, but I'm just going to kind of give you more support for it. We often focus on the productive outcome of writing, and that can sometimes dominate our language teaching, and we think we've got to get to writing really fast. One of the saddest things I think we did in our education system in this country is when we took speaking and listening out of GCSE and said it was no longer part of the main mark. I think that's impoverished some of our current learners, because when it was part of the full mark, and I taught GCSE English as well, I still do alongside ESOL and other subjects, you would have learners able to talk because they knew that it was going to count, and therefore it gave them a little bit more ownership and importance to it. And through that talk, they were learning to construct thought. And that's a vital part of learning to write effectively. And what I'm probably teaching some of you to suck eggs here, if not all of you. I'm sorry about that, but let me still make the point. To have that moment of construct, as I'm doing now in a way, to have those moments of constructing thought means that you bring a clarity to your expression. Once you've done that, it becomes much easier to think about constructing a piece of writing. I think in most areas of education, we focus so much on the written product that we don't give learners the understanding that if, for example, if you're going to write an essay, it doesn't matter what your subject it's on, if you actually speak out your thinking, you're going to discover what you really think. And if you speak it out to someone else, you're going to have to take responsibility for your language because you know you've got an audience, and maybe you'll get challenged, which would be useful. But how many of us in our own educational experience, and I include myself in this, tried to write an essay by sitting on our own in a room in front of a computer or a pad and just gathering our thoughts, but never spoke them out? If we'd spoken them out in the first place, I think our writing would have been much more effective. So I'm really encouraging you, and using this as a focus, to think carefully about the space you give to talk, and to enabling learners to think about, how do I want to express this particular thing that I'm thinking about. Going back to my Thai learner from last week, once we'd done the whole daffodil thing, to be honest, she didn't stop talking for most of the lesson. It was lovely to hear her voice because we've not heard it much before. But there were, and she kept, she wanted things, she had lots of things she wanted to say, but because she had an audience, she was really thinking about how she wanted to say them. And it was lovely to see her finding the opportunity to self-edit her language and to become more effective in doing that. Sometimes learners can teach themselves, you know, and they only need us to go, yeah, that's right, it works. Or perhaps you could try this. So discussion. Discussion is also going to lead you to realize there's a gap in my knowledge here. And if I'm honest, I need to look that up. So that's going to lead to research, obvious opportunities for reading. Okay. And if you talk about what do they like about the classroom, that might seem like, well, where's the research in that? Well, if we click on, there's some other things they can do. I don't know if it's the next point. That's what they don't like. Yeah, look up other learning environments. One of the delightful things I have as a job here at OCN London is I moderate some work from China, where they're doing forest school learning. And the learning environments I've got to see as a result of that are really interesting. Very different from a classroom you might think of as a classroom. So get learners to do some stuff around that. How could we challenge the whole notion of a classroom? You know, do we need to have our tables set up in this way? Do we need to have this number of chairs around each table? Do we need to keep that area clear for whatever reason you might have decided, or could we do something different? That's obviously about generating ideas for the classroom, making a list of improvements and so on. But then to bring the green element in, you could challenge them and say, okay, any change we want to make, we're going to make in this classroom has to make it greener than it was before. And I'm not just talking about colour. It's got to be more environmentally friendly. We are not allowed to have a negative impact on the environment with any change that we make to this classroom. Now, that's a huge challenge, but it could be a really motivating and interesting one, and one that you can make quite a game. You could even, if you've got the resources for this, you can make it a competition with some kind of reward at the end of it. You know, the group that comes up with the best green way to change this classroom is going to win X, whatever that might be. And then it doesn't stop. If you've made the changes, well, the classroom's soon going to fall apart if no one cares for it. And I suspect some of the changes might be, we need a few more plants in here. So somebody's going to have to look after them. You might even want animals, I don't know. That could be too controversial. But if you're going to do those things, then get the learners actively involved in caring for the environment too. Okay, I'm going to pause here just for a moment. And in the chat, is there anything else that some people would want to put in terms of how you could involve green issues in the classroom environment, if you keep it as specific as that? I'll just give you a moment to see if there's any other ideas out there, maybe things you've already done that you would want to share with the group.
We're going to keep the text and the audio and videos off for now.
Yeah, just type it into the chat at the moment. Okay, I'm going to give you another minute because I've got plenty to say still, as I'm sure you realise. Are we getting anything?
I haven't seen anything yet.
All right. Okay, I'm going to move on. But if you were in the middle of typing, don't stop, and we'll pick it up in a minute. Okay, so let's go to the next slide.
So create a manifesto.
Oh yes, sorry, I forgot that. Yes, create a manifesto. Statement that you could have for your class. This is what this class is about, and something that you then offer to other colleagues too. Okay. Going on from there, I've kind of alluded to this already, but remember that you may be, don't want to insult anyone here, but you might be the least expert person on green issues in your class. It might be your learners already know a lot more than you do and have a lot they want to say, and they might actually be released by you tackling this topic and think, yes, great, this is something I've got lots to say about, and you could be pleasantly surprised by what they have to say. So obvious things. What green actions do they take? Second point, I think, is very valid, because I think we all feel this. What would we like to do more of? I think there's a faint guilt that we constantly feel, perhaps a little bit of an existential crisis around about, oh, I should be doing more of this, I should be doing more of that. So, you know, voice those. It's always a little bit less of a burden once you've got it out in the open and people have gone, well, you're not so bad because you want to put plastic in the compost bin or something like that. What would they improve about their local environment? Again, this is about ownership. They have a voice in their local environment. I think a lot of ESOL learners feel like intruders, and a lot of the language in our country doesn't help with that, sadly. But they have a place. They're in their community. They live in their community. They are therefore a part of their community. And what would they want to say that could be improved? And because they've come perhaps from not perhaps, they will have come from another part of the world, they may have a very different view of their environment for the people who live there locally. And if you don't understand that, just think about places you've been to abroad and how you will have seen them differently from the people who live there. They'll have forgotten to see or stopped seeing certain things that you now notice, good or bad. So you may well have ideas about that. And likewise, your learners will too. Have they ever protested about green issues? That might well be the case. It's becoming more common. And I don't just mean going on the streets or sitting in the middle of the road. I mean writing to someone or complaining about something. Have they ever done that? And if so, what was it? How are green issues tackled in other parts of the world, and what is their experience? I have to say, and I hate to say this is going to be a growing thing for us. There are parts of the world that are going to become more difficult to live in, inevitably, over the next few years, and people are going to have to leave them and find somewhere else to live. So we're going to have people wanting to come to Britain, and probably who will end up in Britain too, who have had direct experience of forest fires, of flooding, of terrible storms, of the sea levels rising, and so on. Those are obvious ones, but there are other environmental issues that are perhaps less obvious. You know, North African students who may well now be experiencing more degradation of the environment as topsoil gets blown away, for example. So, you know, they'll have things, and what then is being done, which perhaps we don't hear about on the news, because our news is so focused on just certain issues. And like I said at the bottom, they're the experts here. In this situation, your role can change a little if you're not already doing this. You become much more the facilitator of their language. You know, they want to express something, they've got something to say, help them to tease it out and to find the right way to express it, and then maybe express it even better and more powerfully. And I haven't put this on the side, and perhaps I should have done. When I talk about being the facilitator of the language, I often sit with a notepad next to me in lessons, writing down things that my learners say as closely as I can. And if I've got enough time, I'll try and get it pretty accurate. Things that I want to reflect back to them that they've got really right and need to be celebrated and reflected back to the whole class as something that everybody can own. But then also things that perhaps are slightly awkward. And it may not just be because grammatically they're wrong or syntactically they're wrong. It might be that the emphasis is wrong. It might be that they've not got quite the right word to express the whole meaning of what they're trying to capture. It's hard enough for native speakers, but for second language learners, it can be even more difficult to understand the full nuances of that. And if you're really not clear on this, and I'm sure you probably are, but I'll say this anyway, just think of idiomatic expressions. I had a German mum, and her malapropisms were hilarious. The amount of times she misheard an expression and then said it, and I'm desperately trying to think of a good example right now. But I remember us just in fits of, and thank goodness she was an emotionally secure mum, because she could take it, but we would just be in fits of laughter at some of the things she said. What was it? She instead of saying, "I'm going round the bend," she said something completely different, but you knew she was trying to say that. It was something like, no, she said, I'm going around the bend. And another one she often got wrong was, and I bet some of you do as well, she thought tenterhooks, you know, I'm on tenterhooks. She thought that was tenderhooks for a long time. And I'm still not convinced she believed me, even to her dying day, but there you go. So those sorts of things, you know, you can reflect back as well. Anyway, move on. I could get lost in that too easily. Okay, stage it now. If we put all of this up, actually, because I want to show you this all in one go. I'm sure you're fairly familiar with this, and there are many models of the stage of language learning. And I'll explain on the next slide why I've kind of taken a side step to look at this for a moment. But if you can just look at this model and get this in your head. And as I say, you may be familiar, you may have other models of language learning, but let's just take this one as an example for the moment. So pre-production, let's say we take the 5-stage model, pre-production. When people are learning language, and I'm not just talking about ESOL learners, I'm talking about anybody learning any language that isn't their first language, people tend to be quite silent while just trying to get some kind of understanding of language in the first stages. We don't want to speak, we just want to listen a little bit and take some things in. Totally natural, nothing wrong with that. Early production, where you're getting a little bit more confidence and you're starting to pronounce new words, and maybe you start to put little phrases together, but it's very much vocabulary focused. It's not really focused around the syntax and the grammar and the glue that holds language together. You're just trying to get those words in your mouth, basically. Speech emergence, where you get now you're putting things together, you're starting to speak and write in sentences, and now syntax and grammar is starting to have an impact. And you're starting now to sound like someone who could hold a little bit of a conversation in that language. You're not just pointing at something and hoping that the person understands the word you've said. You can actually interact and respond to something they might say. Okay, intermediate fluency, and this is a key thing, where students start to think and form responses in a new language. And that's a key thing, where you're thinking in the language. You're not just translating, you're actually you're now immersed in language to a point where without thinking about it, you're already there. I don't know if any other people in the group, probably a number of you do, speak a second language really, really well, where if you heard that language, you wouldn't realize that you switched languages. You move from English to that other language very easily. For me, that's German, because, as I've already said, my mum was German. I grew up speaking German as well as English. So I don't notice when I'm watching television and it's a film that may be subtitled, that it might have gone into German. To me, that's just as normal as English. It's that starting to get to that stage, that's stage 4. Then we have the advanced fluency, where I think it was Juliana sticking a thumb up, thank you, where people really are now fully immersed in language, not really thinking about it, and you're just delighting in that resource and enjoying playing with language in that language as much as your own. Okay, so those are 5 stages of learning. Now, if we go to the next slide, why have I put this up here? And this is going to be a little bit controversial. This is where I want to be provocative. I think you can take, well, not I think, I've done it. You can take a narrow area, a specific topic, and actually show learners with that topic how they can progress through, maybe not right up to 5th stage, maybe only on the fringes of 4th stage, but you can take learners at entry 1 and get them up to a much higher level in their learning of language in that specific area by focusing on it almost exclusively. Now, why is that useful? I think it's useful because it shows a learner they can acquire language and it's within their skill set to be able to do so. It may not be the case that they find it as easy to write as to speak, but if you are constantly talking around green and environmental issues, An entry 1 learner is going to start to learn vocabulary in that area way beyond entry 1. And you'll be surprised at some of the terminology that they start using that you would not expect to hear in an entry 1 classroom. For example, going back to a previous slide, and I have done this myself this was actually an entry 2's class, but they were starting at the end of a half term where we'd talked about these issues exclusively. They were starting to use terms like carbon neutral, carbon offset, zero emission, and they knew what they were talking about. Now, the grammar around it wasn't perfect by any means, but those terms were clearly used. And what I find useful for this is it's kind of self-demonstrating to a learner that if you are passionate about something in a particular language, you will have the motivation to acquire that language. And what you've now demonstrated to yourself is what you need to do to acquire a breadth of language outside of that narrow area. And it can become, for many learners, an incredibly motivating way of actually learning language. Now, it is controversial because I've not seen any particular language theories of teaching language actually work with this, but I can tell you it works. And maybe one day I'll write a book about it. It's worked in the classroom for me, and my learners have then found, I didn't statistically measure this, but this is more by feel. My learners seem to find it easier then to acquire other language in other areas more quickly than I would normally have expected them to do so. And that's probably because they understood they could. And they weren't so worried. I mean, there's so much fear around language learning, isn't there? Just think about when you've learned a language, you know, and you know, I went to Greece last autumn, and the amount of Greek I spoke there was tiny because it's the first time I'd been there, and I was very nervous about sounding like a complete idiot. So there's a lot of fear around that, but when that fear gets removed, when you actually show, look, this is what you can do, this is how it can grow, then you give them a confidence and an understanding of their own learning, which is beyond what you can actually teach them. They've learnt it for themselves. So all of those points really on this slide here are about that. It's motivating, you're working through the stages of language acquisition, you're showing how that happens, and hopefully you're motivating your learner. And sometimes, I haven't done this recently, but I have done this in my past, mix your classes up. If you're in a larger college, we so separate learners into entry 1, 2, and because we have to for exams. But why not every so often bring in your level 1 learners to work with entry 1? Or vice versa, and just see what happens. And if, as often will be the case, you've got people from a similar cultural background, that of course creates a level of safety. I'm not saying that they should speak in their first languages, that's what you don't want to happen, and people usually quickly understand the rules of that, but it does at least give it a common understanding of the difficulties of language acquisition, which may be influenced by a first cultural background. Okay, so there's my thinking around that. Do I want you to respond? I'll give you a moment. I'll give you a couple of minutes just to see if anyone wants to respond to that. And if I move on before you finish making your response, don't stop. I don't know if we got a response previously to any other ideas for greening the classroom. Okay, all right. It's a Wednesday afternoon. You want to sit and listen. I fully understand. By the way, I said we were finishing at 3:30. I meant 4:30. And I think you probably got that.
Julia totally agrees with your theory.
Okay, nice. Okay, try it out.
And has attempted it with employability skills.
Oh, good. Okay. Okay, good. That sounds like a very effective way of doing it. Yes, because of course people are motivated. I want a job. Excellent. Good. That's good to hear. All right, let's move on.
Yeah, that's it for now. But maybe they can't hear me. But the thing about mixing levels of learners.
Yes.
I wouldn't. You know. It's not
okay. Amajit is just saying he wouldn't have thought of mixing learners levels up. Yeah, I have to confess, I don't think anyone is here who worked with me at the time. In a college that will remain nameless, I forced my staff to do that when I was head of an ESOL section. They hated me at first. I'm sorry, I apologise for that. But I said, once a term, I want you to mix with a level that is completely different from your own. And you have to tell me when you're doing it and what you're doing, and I'm going to come in and have a watch. And they were great fun, the classes. And it only took one go for most people to be convinced it was worth doing. So there you go.
Great.
Moving on. So we're going to give you some examples now from our environmental strand of exams. If I can just explain for those of you who aren't familiar with the OCN London ESOL assessments, without going into too much detail. The way these work is that if you're signed up to do an OCN London ESOL assessment, you get the exam papers in advance. So you know what language is coming up and you can pre-teach it to your learners. You obviously can't show them the exam until they actually do it, but you can pre-teach anything you want to them, which enables us then to use what we hope is more realistic language in the assessments, because the vocabulary can be pre-taught. For example, there was an assessment, which is not this strand, where I think we included something about the cable car that goes from one side of the Thames over to the O2. And then that was an entry 1 or entry 2 exam. So not really a level at which you'd be expecting learners to know about cable car, but by being able to pre-teach that, then it meant that they could actually deal with some more interesting language around transport in London. So you get the assessments in advance, you can pre-teach the language and you can do them anytime you want to. And then the assessments are actually assessed by the centre and moderated by us. Okay, so the external element of the ESOL assessments with OCN London is the fact that we set them. And at any one time, there are 3 strands or subjects or themes or whatever the terminology is that we use operating. So at the moment we have environmental awareness, we have employment and popular culture and the arts. And you can choose whichever one of those you want to do. And each assessment has 2 opportunities in it to meet the assessment criteria. So learners are given plenty of chance to actually succeed. So just so you've got a bit of background about the way that they work. Now, this is from an entry 1 speaking task where the learner interacts with an interlocutor who's usually also the assessor. And this is a fairly obvious thing to do, to be honest. This is not rocket science, but you can see the green, I don't want to say wash because it's negative, the green overview of this, going to the council, finding out about recycling. I know it's unrealistic to go to a council's reception desk, but it's a little easier doing that than being on a phone. And so it allows for this interaction where they ask for help, they ask how they recycle, and they listen to any questions. Now, you can quite reasonably say back to me, but recycling is not an entry 1 word. No, it isn't, but pre-teach it. But everything else about this is entry 1. The constructions of the questions and the process of the conversation is what would be appropriate. It's a fairly simple conversation to have, okay? The key discussion points on the right-hand side aren't things the learner sees. They're things that I would say you need to pre-teach. You can't just say go to the council without talking about what a council is. You can't talk about recycling without obviously making sure they understand it and so on with rubbish. The last point is a very interesting point, particularly the amount of fly tipping we get around my local area. But how do we get rid of rubbish in this country? It may be a very different experience from their own, and they may well do it better in their country than we do here. A lot do. So that's entry 1. If we move on.
Maybe just the point, Neil, again, you probably can't hear me, but recycling is so real because it's something, your council will expect you to do it.
Absolutely, yes. Recycling, Amit was saying recycling is so real. And what was a comedy program where they had a really boring and intense discussion about how they recycle in the different areas? It was part of a sketch show, and it was hysterical because what it exposed is you've only got to move a few streets away, and suddenly you're in a whole regime of different recycling where green doesn't mean what it meant there, and grey doesn't mean what it meant there. And by the way, the days are completely different, and they only come once every 3 weeks for that, and once every week for that. So how on earth are your learners coping with that? That really and that in itself is a discussion. How do we enable people to be green if we do stuff like that all the time? Anyway, move on to the next slide. Entry 3 writing. So obviously higher level. What's going on here? This was written, I think this assessment was written about 4 or 5 years ago. I remember writing it, and little did we know at that point how much, I mean, it was kind of in the background, the news, but we didn't know how big a thing energy was going to be. But it's one of the things that is talked about almost all the time. You know, Martin Lewis talks about it every week on his program, as far as I'm aware, and it's certainly on his website all the time. So you want to submit an article to a money-saving website about how to save money on gas and electricity bills, and then it's the construction. You include 2 paragraphs with different ideas for saving money on gas and electricity bills. So again, just by dealing with that, you're right in their lives. Your learners will be really concerned about it. I'm thinking about another learner I have, Vietnamese in origin, who works in a nail bar, and her manager refuses to put the heating on. Even in the January was a total, I mean, how on earth do you do nails when you're absolutely freezing? I don't know. But, you know, refused to do it because energy was too expensive, and it generated, this was something she brought up in the first 10-minute bit of our class. And I couldn't stop them. Every learner in the classroom wanted to solve the problem for her, which was wonderful to see. They all had things that they wanted to say about what she could say to her manager, but then one learner who knew a lot about energy had lots of ideas about what you could do. He even, I don't know if anyone ever does this, but he even went through the idea of, you know, you can get a candle and a plant pot with a hole in the top, bottom of the plant pot, and if you put it over the candle, it apparently heats up a room really quickly and very cheaply. You know, you've only got to get a tea light and a little plant pot, and you generate a huge amount of energy from it because it's kind of ceramic, I suppose, which is a very good heat producer, and you've got hot air rising. Try it out sometime. I haven't yet, but maybe there's a handy tip for you. So, yeah. If you're doing that assessment, you can have lots of discussions around things to do with that. You can see the obvious focus there. Okay, and then we've got one at a higher level. I think the next one I've given you, next slide is I think it's level 1, no, level 2. Level 2 reading. Okay, same series. As this was written just after this Intergovernmental Panel, actually. So on 8th October 2018, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change released a vital report on the state of climate science. Look at the language that's going on here. It warned that if the planet warmed by 1.5 degrees centigrade, there'd be some devastating consequences, such as loss of most coral reefs. I'm not going to read it all. You can read it yourself. But a lot of pre-teaching that leads to some very rich language around that. You know, it's taken. This is just a tiny extract from a much longer text that was from a newspaper. So there's some quite loaded language around it as well. This is a newspaper if you read the second paragraph, you can probably see it was attacking what the government then failed to do as a response. So, you know, you can be preparing your learners, going back to what I was saying earlier, for some of the loaded language that we use around green and environmental issues. And these questions that I've given you under the discussion points there are deliberately provocative to a large extent. I think question 3 is a really interesting one. What is the role of government? I don't think as a global community we have any idea what the role of the government is. On the one hand, we want them to do something about it. On the other hand, we don't expect them to. So what then is their role? And therefore, what is our role? And therefore, should we protest? Is there any point in protesting? Or do we just do things at a local level and get on with it and just want our politicians to allow us to do that? I don't know. I haven't got the answer to that, but we do seem to be in a very weird place in terms of what we expect government to do about environmental issues generally. And you can see by the questions I've asked there, you wouldn't be asking those necessarily unless you've been doing a lot of work on the environment at a lower level, but you are preparing your learners for higher level text work here. those kind of discussions. Okay, I'm moving on quite fast. This is, I think, pretty much the last slide, because I want to give 10 minutes at the end for anyone to ask any questions or make any responses to anything I've said. So green links with other subjects. Okay, this is a bit of audience participation time. Can you put into the chat, if you just look at the image on the right there, what subjects do you think are represented in that image? What, and by that I mean what curriculum subject areas can you see that might have a relationship with the image that I've given you on the right there? Just put them into the chat, first things that come to mind.
Can you see the chat? We've got deforestation, science, engineering.
Right, yes, I can see it now. Okay, I've got it, you don't need. So science, engineering, employability. Okay, I'm looking really more, thank you for deforestation, employability, but I want you to be thinking about subjects that are taught in your college or your school specifically. Yeah, I do a lot of things about town playing life in the future, but I want some curriculum subjects. So we've got science and engineering so far. Art, brilliant. I was hoping somebody would spot that. What a brilliantly artistic representation this is. Media, excellent. Where would this image be used? How would it be used? Would it be part of an advert trying to persuade you to buy a product? Okay, any other subjects you can see? So we've got science, engineering, art and media. Anything else that you can see in there? Okay, break some of these down. You said science. Let's go a bit more specific. Architecture, thank you. I was hoping somebody would say that. Absolutely. What a beautifully designed modern building that is. It's a really attractive image, isn't it? Geography, yes, of course. Where is this? Where could this be? What is happening in the local environment around it? Maths, brilliant. So, you know, what are the measurements of this thing? You know, is it a mathematically feasible thing to make? Business, well done, thank you. Yes, absolutely. So what business might this be? How might this business work? Where might the different departments be situated within this business? Yep, engineering, thank you. Right, good. Okay, you've got the idea. Now, imagine you took that image into an ESOL classroom and you ask them a similar thing. They may not come up with the subject names. AI, that's an interesting one, thank you. Yes, because you're spot on, I don't know if you knew that, but this is an AI generated image. But if you took this into the classroom as an image and said, okay, you ask them the same question, what subjects can you see? They may not talk about curriculum subjects, may come up with other things. Then the next stage of what you can do is say, okay, give me some words associated with that and start to get the language of those subjects out. Some of you were already doing this, but you can then go another step on as a second question suggests, what careers are represented here? You know, who would be involved, firstly, in making a place like this and allowing it to happen, but then in continuing to operate a place like this. I love the fact that it's quite an abstract image, that you don't know what this thing does. It could be a number of different things. It kind of looks a bit like a factory, but it also looks a bit like an office. And I like that because then you've got lots of freedom around that in terms of having lots of discussion about different kinds of jobs. And you'll probably find there are people in your classroom who want to do these different jobs. And again, what's the language of the careers, the career that they might be thinking of going into? And something else I think you can bring out of this, of course, and it's a very obvious point, but I think it's one that we can overlook at times. Language learning doesn't just happen in the classroom. I've already alluded to that with when I've talked about my first 10 minutes of a lesson. You know, highlighting the fact that learners are learning language all the time, again, enables them and perhaps gives them a little bit more confidence to think, okay, when I'm out on the street, be observant, listen to what's going on, don't hide away, don't pretend I can't talk, but actually get involved in that. Okay, thank you, Jacqueline, for the idea of kind of people that could be involved in this place as well, gardeners and operators. And linked to this, take back I've talked about the way language is misused, but there's also a chance for the learners to reinvent the language for themselves. You know, take a word like renewable, which is a way overused word in our culture, and I don't think, again, it's a word that we really understand. What does it really mean if you really break that word down to renew something? Is it ever really possible? Because basically what you're saying is to make new again. Is that possible? Maybe, maybe not. But you need to define what new means, perhaps, before we can actually answer that. And again, as I said there at the bottom, it unravels concepts. Now, I'm sure that you can see that just from this fairly simple exercise, it's not hard to forge links with other subject areas once you start thinking about green issues. Nothing is immune from green and environmental issues. Everything is involved. It has to be. It's the only way we're actually going to have effective change. So then it's up to you. You can take an image like this and you can do the exercise in isolation in the classroom and say, okay, we've learned the language, so if you're interested in geography, here are a whole load of geographical terms, and you know that might be something that you take on with you as you pursue your interest. Let me go to an absolute extreme though, and this is a dream, but let's express our dreams because then we might get some way towards them. When I first trained as a teacher back in the 80s, that dates me, I trained as a drama teacher initially, and we were taken as part of our teacher training course, and I don't know if anyone's ever heard of this place, to a place in Milton Keynes called Stantonbury Campus. And it was quite a revolutionary school, which ultimately had to stop what it was doing because the national curriculum came along about 5 years later. But the way Stantonbury Campus worked is that each year group had a block, literally a block, a building that was a block. At the center of each block was a drama studio. And the idea of drama in Stantonbury Campus is that it was a resource. It was a subject in its own right. Every student did drama as a subject, but they also were there as a resource. So if a science teacher was having a problem explaining a concept in the classroom, and you get it in that terrible advert on the television at the moment, which says teaching is an absolutely wonderful thing, and you know you'll only have nice kids and so on. And there's a point at which I think he's trying to teach something about the blood system, it seems, and he gets the kids to jiggle around the classroom a bit, and then they all are happy about biology and suddenly understand everything, which is what happens every day, of course. But taking that seriously for a moment, if a science teacher was having a problem with teaching a concept and wanted it to be visualized and made 3D, they would go to the drama teacher and say, can I book you for a drama science session, and can we explore together this concept and find a way for the kids to engage with it and actually discover more. And this worked in a really effective way. Their results as a school were amazing. They were off the roof, off the planet. Gosh, have I just done a mum? You know, they really did incredibly well beyond what their demographic normally should have done. ESOL could be the same. And it wouldn't necessarily be limited to second language learners. Wouldn't it be interesting if ESOL actually included native speakers? There's a controversial point. But imagine that your ESOL classroom was the resource where your geography or humanities teacher came to you and said, my students really aren't getting this concept. They don't understand what it's about. Is there something going on linguistically that I can explore with you and we can have a bit of input? I doubt that's going to happen in the near future because that would take such a massive reorganization, but you can do it in a small way. You can at least take control within your classroom and say, what are the subject areas that you're interested in? And just by producing an image, it obviously doesn't have to be this one, you'll discover from your class by the things that they say back to you. There's a lot of focus here in the chat around the sciences and around things to do with town planning and architecture and so on, which to me expresses where your level of interest may be. So you can then discover what it is your class is interested in, and you can bring more of that language in, and maybe you can add a green element to it. So that's a thought around how to link ESOL through green issues with other subject areas. I know I've thrown a lot at you there, and I haven't actually given you 10 minutes, I've given you 6. But I'm going to stop for a moment, and let's just see, I've got the chat up in front of me here. So are there any things that you either want to comment on or questions that you want to ask around anything that I've said this afternoon?
Is that the last slide?
Well, apart from the thank you slide, I think so.
Shall I maybe enable chat? I mean, enable voices.
If you want to speak rather than type, if you put
enable the
yeah, Amage's going to enable your microphones so that you can do that. But put your hand up first, perhaps, before you speak. That doesn't mean, by the way, that you're automatically on. It means that you can click on them and then speak if you want to. So any thoughts, any questions around anything I've said this afternoon?
Sorry, I didn't press the save button because I'm a fool. There we go.
Okay, good, thank you. Maybe I've worn you all out. Oh, hand up here.
Paula.
Yes.
Oh, hi. Can you hear me? Hi.
Yep.
I work in an adult education college, and obviously we have a lot of asylum seekers and refugees and people that they're not well off. And I came on this because I need ideas of how making these relevant to them. Obviously, you say that you might, in your class, you might find people more experienced than you. I kind of have the opposite, where their life is so tragic at the moment that environment is not a subject that is actually enters their consciousness, because they have to be worried about so many other things. But clearly here, they live here, they need to know how to recycle, and so we use recycling as an environment, but I don't know how to make it a little bit more relatable to those people.
I think it is entirely relevant, and you just need to think a little bit laterally about it, or make the connections in a different way, Paula. So your learners are probably, depending on how they live, they're going to be concerned about 2 issues at the forefront of their mind. Firstly, how do I cheaply keep myself warm in the winter? That's an environmental issue. How do they generate energy that's affordable? You know, maybe my plant pot thing is a thing that they could try out. I don't know. But there are things that probably other asylum seekers in your class might know that they don't. Or there may be funds that they can draw on, support that they can find, that may help them in generating energy. That's one thing. The other thing is travel. That's always going to be a cost for them. How do they travel cheaply from one place to another? You know, and I wouldn't say it's about green issues. That can limit it perhaps too much. Maybe I've overused that word this afternoon. Environmental issues. So it might be that one learner knows a shorter route to get to college than another learner, and they can be sharing with each other those levels of experience. And it goes back to what I was saying earlier about you being a facilitator then of the language. Allow those conversations to happen and record the language that's being used. And then if it needs to be adjusted, that's where you step in. But if it's good language, then reflect that back to them as well. Both things need to be done. And I would say that environmental issues are always about every part of our life. I know I made the point about, you know, everyone's got a voice, but you're absolutely right, Paolo. If you're an asylum seeker with no money, then that isn't going to be at the forefront of your mind. You just want to get through the day and the week, but that will still be an environmental issue. Yes, and there are other things that exactly people in your class may well be being very resourceful about how they recycled, so they didn't have to keep buying new things. Is there something that can be shared that way that we don't know about? Does that
Thank
help?
you. Yes, it did.
Okay. Great, good. Thank you. Thank you for the question. All right.
There's one in the chat as
Okay.
well.
That was about the recycling things, yeah?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay, yes. All right, what time for one more question, if anyone's got one?
We've got Eileen who's got her hand up.
Okay, go for it. This is
Hi
Eileen.
there. It's not a question as such. It's just the previous one, Paula's issue that she raised. I actually mostly teach teenagers, so
Right.
they are usually not very well informed about these issues. And I noticed over the years that jars are a good place to start, because I noticed that mums and nans, and if it's a too sensitive subject to talk about the family, older people in their community, what did they use this for? And they use them again and again and again, and they keep them, and for many things, and they make jams and they make other things and preserve food. And I found that's a good place to start. The idea of recycling, reusing jars.
Yeah. Wouldn't it be great if you just bring in a jar into the classroom and say, right, what can you use this for? That would be a wonderful exercise. Huge amounts of language that could come out of that. Brilliant. Thank you, Ellen. That's lovely. Great.
A good one there about what about upcycling?
Yes. Making something better. Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Jacqueline. All right. Well, it's beyond past. I hope this session has been useful for you. And do keep in touch with us. I think we're intending to do another one probably next term. Don't know yet what the topic might be. If you've got any suggestions of topics you might like us to cover in terms of ESOL teaching, and let us know, and we'll see whether we can address them. But thank you for engaging, and I wish you well for the rest of today and the rest of the week.
Can I just
and Amajit has something to say.
You just want to mute for a second?
Okay, I'm going to mute.
I'm just going to add that I'll be sending you the slides, the recording of this presentation probably tomorrow, along with some links to our ESOL Skills for Life page. If you're not yet a centre, why not consider becoming one? If you're not delivering our ESOL, please consider it, and you'll have people like Neil and myself on hand for any questions you may have. And thank you for coming today.
Thank you.
I'm going to stop the recording and release you all to